Let me begin to explain how they got us into this satanic theocracy by first asking you, the viewer, a question that I ask many others in my travels. The question is this: is there any kind of neutral ground for us as individuals between serving either Yahweh, which is the God of the Bible, or Satan? Is there a neutral ground there? Most folks, after thinking for a moment, will honestly answer a simple no. I then ask my next question, which is, if there is no place set aside for those who can't make up their minds in their individual lives, then can there be any kind of neutral ground for one's church or one's family structure? And of course, they usually again answer, but a little more quickly, no, of course, and that makes sense. I then ask my last question, which is this one. Then how can there be any kind of a neutral ground for us as a Christian nation in our government structure? And most of them begin to get their gears turning on that one and sometimes start to see where I'm heading. But the fact remains that there is no such thing that any thinking man can use to justify creating a separate classification system for the government of those professing to be children of the living God. Your society either obeys the Father in heaven or it obeys the Lord of this world, Satan. Anything that deviates from the clear written law of Yahweh is a satanic originated law. And if we have even gone so far as to completely replace the Bible that the founding Puritans were using as their law system with a completely new system that, as it states itself in Article 6, is the, quote, supreme law of the land, unquote, then we are in a satanic government system, or a literal satanic theocracy. So let's look at it this way. Now that we know that there can be no such thing as any kind of special classification for civil government, especially for those claiming to be Christians and thereby opposed to the ways of Satan, and since there is no such thing as a neutral ground, then we must choose one side or the other, just as the Bible itself states, "Choose ye this day whom ye will serve." And no man can serve two masters. You either serve Yahweh or you serve Satan. The elitist founding fathers knew that they could not get a somewhat still biblical nation to simply leave the father system for their Luciferian system, so they created an imaginary neutral zone to supposedly grant great new freedoms for those who wanted to worship their God in any way they saw fit, not telling them that this would someday include their God, Satan. Okay? They then slowly conditioned the world to think that going back to just the Bible alone would be ludicrous and overblown somehow, and that to then live in a dreaded biblical theocracy would be too fanatical. Now that there was this new, of course, they didn't come right out and say it, but this new imaginary neutral ground for world harmony between the religions, just what the ecumenist New World Order wanted all along. Thus they trained the world to think that there is some kind of third plane or decision layer between Yahweh and Satan. This is what the Bible describes as violence, or more deeply, metonymy, which is wordcraft, in Genesis 6:11. In other words, they have re-enslaved us by legalese, as we call it today. When you actually lay out the string of how the word violence in Genesis and in other places of the Bible as well really doesn't always necessarily mean any kind of a physical violence. In fact, it seems more often it's talking about a trickery of some kind, a deceit, a metonymy, unjust gain through deception. Violence, we have learned to use that word violence as a physical form, and I think that's been intentionally done on us as well in the same form of metonymy, to change the word violence to mean what they want it to mean, so we wouldn't know that it even originally meant metonymy. So it's sort of a vicious cycle that catches itself. So now let's take it to the way they really did it. First, they had to do something to get us to think that there would be a middle ground. And the way they did that basically was through separation of church and state. And there's people today that are still crying for the separation of church and state, and a lot of them are Christians. They don't realize what they're doing. Well, there's no such thing as a separation between church and state, as we've just shown here. You either follow the Father's law system or you follow the Satan's law system. And that's for yourself individually, as yourself as a family, as a church unit, and your local government, and even a national government. You all follow the same system. There shouldn't be some kind of a line of demarcation between us, our families, and our churches, and some separate entity called a government. It should all be one law system. And this is where the separation of church and state becomes the trickery. Because in the 1700s, they began this separation of church and state idea. As you can see on the screen, we've got the way the Founding Fathers tried to portray this. This would be great. Uncle Sam is the big muscle that keeps the church and the state separate. That way it holds Satan down, as the way they tried to portray it. But as you see in the next illustration, they knew eventually that they would switch Satan and the church. And eventually, of course, the UN and their god, Lucifer, would be in charge. And that's how they did that, through separation of church and state. In other words, they take you into the neutral ground, then slowly the neutral ground becomes obvious that neutral ground isn't really a neutral ground, and it's truly Satan's jurisdiction. And we've got to realize this. This is something so hard to get across to people, so I'm trying to make it simpler on this illustration. Some of you have seen the other video called Satan's Illusion of a Neutral Ground. You can go back and watch that, and it makes it more clearly understandable for the individual and their churches, I guess. But here I'm trying to show how a state government cannot, at the same time, profess to be a Christian nation, at the same time have a government that's completely secular or neutral. It doesn't happen. It's an oxymoron. All right, well, folks, thanks a lot for your time. I hope this one cleared some things up. Blessings to you all. Have a great day.